My name is Jenna, I'm 28 years old, and 3 days before my wedding, my father looked me in the eye and said he would not walk me down the aisle unless I took a DNA test to prove I was really his daughter. He didn't say it in anger. He said it like it was reasonable, like asking for scientific proof of my existence was no different from asking about the guest list or the flowers. His exact words were, "You don't look like me, Jenna. You never have. And I'm not going to stand in front of 200 people pretending certainty I don't feel." I just stood there holding my wedding seating chart, staring at him, wondering how a man could spend 28 years raising me and still make me feel like I was a stranger begging for entry into my own life. I asked him if he was serious. He said he had never been more serious. Then he added that if I refused, he would sit through the ceremony as a guest and let everyone wonder why the father of the bride stayed in his seat. That was the moment something in me changed. I didn't cry. I didn't plead. I just looked at him and realized that this was no longer about resemblance. It was about power. It was about humiliating me at the one moment in my life that was supposed to feel sacred. And the worst part? He thought he was the one holding the weapon. He had no idea that if I agreed to that test, the truth waiting on the other side would tear through his life harder than anything he had ever imagined. Before I tell you what happened after I said yes, tell me, what time is it where you are right now? And where are you watching from? I really want to see how far this story travels. The next morning, I sat across from my mother at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, cooling untouched between my hands and 1,000 wedding notifications flashing across my phone like they belonged to somebody else's life. My florist wanted approval on the centerpieces. My maid of honor was asking whether the bridesmaids should arrive early for photos, and my fiancé had sent me 3 messages that morning, each sweeter than the last, each one making my chest tighten, because I still had not found the words to tell him that my father had turned our wedding week into a paternity trial. My mother stood by the stove pretending to be busy with breakfast, but I knew her too well. She wasn't cooking because she was hungry. She was moving because stillness would have forced her to look at me. Finally, I said, "How long has he been thinking this?" She stopped moving for half a second, then reached for a plate she didn't need. "Your father has always been proud," she said, which was such an insultingly incomplete answer that I almost laughed. "That's not what I asked," I told her. "I asked how long he has been looking at me like a question mark instead of a daughter." She turned then, slowly, and I saw something in her face that made me sit up straighter. It wasn't just shame, it was fatigue. The kind of fatigue that comes from carrying an old secret so long that even standing upright starts to look like effort. "He started making comments when you were small," she admitted. "Not every day, not even every month, but enough. Enough that I remember each one." I stared at her. "What comments?" She put the plate down and folded her hands together like she was bracing for impact. "That your smile didn't come from his side of the family, that your hair was too dark, that your features were too sharp, that your habits were different." He would say it casually at first, like a joke no one else found funny. Then later, when we were alone, he would circle back to it and ask me whether I had ever lied to him. I felt something harden inside me. "And what did you say?" Her eyes met mine. I said no, because I had not. I wanted that answer to calm me, but it didn't. If anything, it made the room feel more unstable. "Then why are you acting like the DNA test scares you too?" I asked. She looked away immediately, and that tiny movement told me more than any denial could have. "Because," she said quietly, "sometimes the truth doesn't arrive by itself. Sometimes it drags old things into the light with it." I pushed my chair back and stood up. "Stop talking to me like I'm a child standing outside a locked room. If there is something you know, say it clearly." She pressed one hand against the edge of the counter. "I don't know anything for certain." "That's not the same as knowing nothing." That landed because she closed her eyes for a moment before speaking again. The night you were born was confusing, she said. Not in a dramatic way. Not in a way I could prove. Just in details. Small details. Nurses checking bracelets twice. A chart taken out and brought back. A delay in the nursery. I remember asking whether everything was fine and being told I was exhausted and emotional. My entire body went still. You never told me that. Because I told myself it was nothing, she said. Because once we brought you home, you were mine. I loved you. I wanted that to be enough. I let out a slow breath that sounded almost like a laugh, except there was nothing funny in it. Enough for who? You? Because it clearly wasn't enough for him. She winced, but I wasn't done. Do you understand what he did to me yesterday? He didn't just ask a question, he put a price on my dignity. He said I could earn the right to have my own father at my wedding if I submitted to being tested like evidence. Tears filled her eyes, but I kept going because I was done making space for everyone else's feelings while mine were being dissected. Did you ever think maybe all those years of silence didn't protect me? Maybe they just protected his comfort? She turned away and whispered, I thought I was keeping the family together. I shook my head. No, you were keeping the illusion together. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The kitchen felt too quiet, too clean, too ordinary for the kind of conversation happening inside it. Then she said the one thing that made me realize how deep this went. If this goes where I think it might go, don't let him control the ending. I stared at her. That sounds like something a person says when she's already seen the edge of the truth. She looked at me with tears in her eyes but didn't answer. That silence told me everything I needed to know. She might not have known the whole story, but she had been living beside its shadow for years. I grabbed my bag from the chair, slid my phone into my pocket, and said, I'm taking the test. She stepped forward. Jenna, not for him, I cut in. For me. And if this family has been built on doubt, silence, and whatever happened the night I was born, then I'm done being the last person to find out. As I walked out, I realized something I had never allowed myself to say before. My father's cruelty had only been possible because my mother's silence had cleared space for it. And when a family teaches you long enough that peace matters more than truth, eventually, the only way to save yourself is to become the person willing to destroy the peace. That afternoon, I met Ethan and Ava at the cafe near the park where I was supposed to get married. The same cafe where we had laughed over centerpiece disasters, bad first dates, and all the ridiculous tiny details that come with planning a wedding. Usually that place made me feel lighter. That day, it felt like I had walked into a waiting room for a version of my life I no longer recognized. Ethan knew something was wrong before I even sat down. Ava stood up halfway out of her chair when she saw my face. I dropped into the seat across from them, put my phone on the table, and said, My father told me he won't walk me down the aisle unless I take a DNA test to prove I'm his daughter. Ava's hand flew to her mouth immediately. Ethan just stared at me for 2 full seconds, then leaned back and said, very calmly, Tell me you threw something at him? I almost smiled, which made me realize how badly I needed to be with people who loved me enough to be angry on my behalf. No, I said. I just stood there. I think part of me was too stunned to move. Ava reached across the table and grabbed my wrist. Jenna, that is not normal. That is not wedding stress. That is not family tension. That is cruelty. I nodded once. He said if I refused, he'd stay seated during the ceremony and let everyone wonder why. Ethan muttered something under his breath that I'm pretty sure would have gotten him kicked out of church if he'd said it any louder. Then he leaned forward and asked, And your mom? I let out a breath. That's the other part. She keeps acting like the result might uncover something bigger. She admitted this morning that the night I was born was strange. Nurses rechecking bracelets, a chart being taken out, delays in the nursery, nothing concrete, but enough that she's been afraid for years. That changed the air at the table. Ethan and Ava looked at each other, and suddenly, This was no longer just a story about a controlling father humiliating his daughter before her wedding. It was something older, messier, buried. "So, your mother thinks something may have happened at the hospital?" Ava asked. "She says she doesn't know anything for certain," I said. "But she knows enough to fear where this could lead." Ethan folded his arms and stared out the window for a second, like he was arranging the pieces in his head. "Okay," he said finally. "Then stop thinking of the DNA test as his demand. Start thinking of it as a key." I frowned. "A key to what?" "To whatever everybody in your family has been avoiding for 28 years, he said. "Look, if your father were just insecure, that would already be awful. But insecurity doesn't explain why your mother looks terrified. That means there's a deeper fracture under this whole thing, and your father just handed you the tool that might crack it open." Ava nodded more slowly. "I hate that he forced this on you. But Ethan's right about one thing. If something is wrong, maybe this is the first time you've actually been close enough to the truth to find it." I looked down at the table, at the condensation sliding down my untouched glass, and said the part I had been too ashamed to admit out loud until then. "I think what hurts most is that some part of me isn't even surprised. Not completely. It's like he's been saying this without saying it my whole life." Ava squeezed my hand. "What do you mean?" I laughed once, bitterly. "Little things. The way he'd pause when people said I look like Mom. The weird jokes about how I must have inherited my stubbornness from somewhere else. The way he always made me feel slightly observed, slightly measured. Like if I didn't act enough like him, or look enough like him, or think enough like him, I was failing some private exam no one else knew I was taking." Saying it out loud made me realize how much of my childhood suddenly rearranged itself under this new light. All the moments that had felt confusing back then now looked ugly and intentional. Ethan's expression darkened. "That's what men like him do," he said. "They turn doubt into a system, and then everybody around them starts calling it personality." Ava gave him a look, but she didn't disagree. "So what are you going to do?" she asked me softly. I stared at them both for a long moment before answering. "I'm taking the test." Ava nodded slowly. Ethan looked relieved, which was not the reaction I expected until he explained it. "Good," he said, "because whether the result comes back positive or negative, he loses." I frowned. "How do you figure?" He didn't hesitate. "If the result says he is your biological father, then he has publicly exposed himself as the kind of man who would humiliate his daughter for nothing. And if the result says he isn't, then this stops being a petty accusation and becomes a real story with consequences bigger than his ego. Either way, the mask comes off." That sat with me, because until that moment I had still been thinking like someone on defense, someone trying to survive an attack. Ethan was forcing me to see another possibility. I could stop reacting and start positioning. Ava, gentler as always, asked the question that mattered more than any strategy. "What do you want, Jenna? Not what your father wants. Not what your mother fears. What do you want?" The answer came out before I could soften it. "I want him to feel what he made me feel." Neither of them judged me for saying it. That mattered more than I can explain. Ethan nodded once. "Then stop trying to win fairness from unfair people. Build consequences." I asked what he would do if he were me. He leaned in and said, "I'd take the test. I'd go wherever the truth leads. And if he's wrong, I would never let him apologize in private and keep his reputation polished in public. Men who use family love as leverage count on secrecy to save them." Ava exhaled slowly, then looked at me with that painfully kind expression only real friends know how to wear. "Just promise me one thing," she said. "Whatever you do next, do it because it frees you, not because it chains you to his ugliness forever." That stayed with me, because revenge sounds simple when you say the word fast. But in real life, Revenge only matters if it breaks the grip someone else had on your story. We talked for another hour, circling through possibilities, practical concerns, the wedding, my fiancé, whether I should tell him more now or wait until I had facts. But underneath every detail was the same truth growing larger. This was no longer a family disagreement. It was an unraveling. And somewhere inside that unraveling was the answer to a question I had never been allowed to ask properly before. Who had benefited from keeping me uncertain? When we finally stood up to leave, Ethan stopped me outside the cafe and said, "One more thing. If this turns out to be bigger than your father, don't get sentimental about exposing it. People who had years to tell the truth and didn't are not innocent just because they look broken when it finally comes out." I looked at him, then at Ava, then toward the park where the white chairs would soon be arranged for my wedding, and I felt something settle inside me. Fear was still there. Hurt was still there. But for the first time since my father made his demand, I could feel something else too. Direction. "I'm done protecting people who made me earn what should have been given freely," I said. And that night, when I booked the DNA test and saved the confirmation email, I understood that I wasn't just agreeing to a procedure. I was opening a door my family had spent nearly 3 decades holding shut with silence, pride, and cowardice. The clinic was 40 minutes away, and my mother insisted on driving me there, which would have been comforting if she hadn't spent the entire ride looking like someone being dragged toward a secret she had been keeping alive with silence for years. I let the quiet sit between us until we were halfway there. Then I opened the voice memo app on my phone and started recording. She noticed almost instantly and asked why I was doing that. I told her because I was done having conversations that conveniently disappeared later. That made her grip the steering wheel tighter. I asked her directly if there had ever been anything strange about the night I was born. At first, she said she didn't know how to answer that, which was the kind of sentence people use when they know exactly how to answer, but are trying to survive the consequences. Then, very slowly, she started talking. She said that after I was delivered, there had been confusion in the maternity ward. Nurses checking bracelets twice. A chart taken out of the room and returned. A longer nursery hold than expected. She said she remembered asking questions and being told she was tired, emotional, overwhelmed. She said my father shut her down every time she tried to bring it up later because he was already suspicious enough to twist any uncertainty into an accusation against her. I sat there frozen as she admitted that part of her had feared for years that something had gone wrong at the hospital. Not enough to act, apparently. Not enough to protect me. Just enough to stay afraid. I asked her why she never told me. She said she thought silence was preserving the family. I told her silence had only preserved my father's comfort. By the time we got to the clinic, I felt calmer than I had in days, because there is a strange kind of clarity that arrives when the lie around your life finally starts taking shape. Inside, everything was sterile and efficient. Paperwork, consent forms, identity checks. A woman in scrubs called my name and led me into a small room for the cheek swab. Before she began, she asked the reason for the test. I almost said wedding dispute, but what came out instead was, because a man confused resemblance with authority. She nodded like she understood more than she let on. The test itself took less than 5 minutes, which felt obscene considering it was about to drag half my life into the light. When I came back outside, my mother asked if I was okay. I told her no, but I was focused. On the drive home, I saved the recording from the car under a name that even surprised me. For when he lies. Then my mother asked softly what I planned to do if the result came back negative. I looked straight ahead and said, "Tell the truth." She asked what if the truth broke my father. I told her some people don't break because truth is cruel. They break because what they did before the truth arrived can no longer be defended. The results came in 2 days later while I was sitting on the edge of my bed trying to finalize wedding details I suddenly no longer cared about. My phone buzzed. I saw the lab notification, and for a second the whole room seemed to narrow around that one tiny glowing screen. I opened the file and read the line twice just to make sure my eyes weren't betraying me. Probability of paternity, 0%. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat there with the report in my hand and felt the world shift into a shape I had been standing too close to recognize. Then I called my mother and told her to come over immediately. When she arrived, I handed her the phone without saying a word. She read the result, covered her mouth, and started crying. But I had no patience left for tears that arrived only after proof. I told her we were going to the hospital where I was born. She looked terrified and asked if it had to be today. I told her yes, because I was done giving lies time to organize themselves. We drove straight there, and once we arrived, I called the labor and delivery department from the parking lot and told them I needed to speak to someone about a possible birth discrepancy connected to a paternity result and long-buried records from 28 years ago. That got their attention fast. After a wait that felt both endless and surgical, we were taken into a consultation room where an older woman named Marlene came in wearing a senior administrative badge and the kind of expression people get when they already know the truth is going to wound everyone in front of them. She looked at me carefully and then at my mother. The first thing she said was, "You have her eyes." My mother went pale immediately. I asked whose eyes she meant, and Marlene sat down and explained that the hospital had sealed internal records involving an identification failure in the newborn unit the night I was born. Then she said the words that split my life open cleanly in two. 2 infants were switched. My mother broke down instantly, but I stopped her because I wanted information before emotion. Marlene explained that the switch had been discovered in internal review but buried under legal damage control, and that the families had not been informed the way they should have been. I asked her to say it clearly. She did. The child my family took home was not genetically related to the man who raised me. My DNA result was accurate. My father was not my biological father, but the larger truth was even uglier than that. My mother was still my biological mother, meaning she had given birth to me. But the hospital confusion and my father's long-held suspicions had created a version of events he found emotionally convenient. Instead of acting like a father and seeking truth when I was a child, he had let doubt become part of the architecture of my life. I asked my mother how long she had suspected enough to be afraid. She said she never knew for certain, but knew enough to fear it. I turned back to Marlene and asked whether my father knew enough to wonder and still chose to humiliate me right before my wedding anyway. No one answered directly, but they didn't need to. Some truths arrive as statements. Others arrive as patterns. And in that room, I finally saw the pattern of my life clearly. My father had spent years demanding proof from me while never once proving he deserved the role he wanted publicly honored. Marlene handed me a folder with the hospital summary and possible legal next steps connected to the other child. I took it, stood up, and told my mother we were going home. She asked if we were going home to talk. I looked at her and said, "No, we're going home to end this." By the time we pulled into my parents' driveway, I already knew exactly what I was going to do. Before we went inside, I told my mother not to interrupt me, not once, because she had already spent 28 years choosing silence, and I was done letting silence stand in the room like it had moral authority. My father was in the den watching television when we walked in, calm as ever, as if the man who had detonated my wedding week deserved an ordinary evening. He muted the TV, looked at me, and asked, "Well, did you do it?" Not, "Are you okay?" Not, "What happened?" Just, "Did you do it?" I pulled out my phone, opened the report, and told him, "You were right. I'm not your biological daughter." The sickest part was that I saw it happen in his face before he could stop it. That tiny flash of vindication, That ugly little spark of a man who thinks his suspicion has finally been rewarded. My mother saw it too and made a sound like she might be sick. He stood up and said, "Then we need to discuss what this means." I actually laughed at that. I told him we absolutely were going to discuss what it meant, but not the version he thought. Then I dropped the hospital folder onto the coffee table and told him the rest of the truth. I told him the hospital had confirmed there was a newborn switch the night I was born. I told him my mother had suspected irregularities for years. I told him that instead of protecting me from uncertainty, he had allowed his ego to use that uncertainty as a private weapon until the day he finally found the perfect public stage, my wedding. He kept looking from me to my mother, demanding explanations. But I didn't let him hide inside confusion. I told him that whether he knew every detail or not no longer mattered, because what exposed him wasn't biology, it was behavior. It was the fact that when given a chance to act like a father, he chose control instead. Then I played the recording from the car, the one where my mother admitted the hospital confusion, the bracelet checks, the years of fear, the silence. By the time it ended, my father looked like someone had torn his authority out by the root. I told him that he had spent my whole life measuring me against his face, and then expected me to stand quietly while he humiliated me before my marriage. I told him if anyone asked why he was no longer walking me down the aisle, I would tell them the truth. If relatives asked, I would tell them. If friends asked, I would tell them. If he lied, I had the test, the hospital records, and the recording. That was the moment he changed. The certainty left his body all at once and something smaller took its place. He asked me, voice shaking now, what I wanted him to do. I told him that the next evening at the rehearsal dinner, he was going to stand up in front of everyone and confess exactly what he had done, that he demanded a DNA test because he judged his daughter by her face, that the truth exposed his failure, and that he had used my most important moment as leverage for his pride. He looked horrified and said I wanted to humiliate him. I told him no, I wanted him to experience a fraction of what he had prescribed for me. He asked if I would really do this to my own father. I looked at him and said the sentence I had needed my whole life. A father would have protected me from this story. You wrote it. I'm just deciding how it ends. That was when he cried. Not nobly, not quietly. He actually cried because for the first time the consequences belonged to him. As I turned to leave, he begged me not to take it public. I stopped at the doorway and said, "You made it public the moment you tied my worth to a wedding aisle." Then I left him there with the evidence, the silence, and the first honest reflection he had probably seen in decades. The rehearsal dinner was held in a private room at the restaurant where my fiancé and I had celebrated our engagement, which made the whole thing feel even more surreal. Candlelight, polished glasses, expensive place settings, smiling relatives who still believed they were attending the last peaceful event before a beautiful wedding weekend. My father arrived late and looked 10 years older than he had the night before. He didn't greet many people. He didn't pretend to be social. He just sat down, avoided eye contact, and held his water glass like it was the only thing in the room he trusted not to expose him. I had not told everyone the full story yet. I only said there had been a serious issue in my family and that by the end of the evening, people would understand why things had changed. Once dinner ended and all the casual conversation faded, my father looked at me from across the room. I gave him a single nod. He stood up slowly, lifted his glass like he was about to make a normal father of the bride toast, and the room quieted instantly. Then he said, "I need to say something before this wedding goes any further." Every face turned toward him. He swallowed hard and admitted that he had demanded a DNA test before agreeing to walk me down the aisle, because I did not look enough like him for him to feel certain. The silence that followed was absolute. My fiancé turned toward me so fast his chair almost scraped. My father kept going because he knew if he stopped, I would finish it for him. He confessed that the test proved he was not my biological father and that hospital records uncovered serious irregularities the night I was born. He admitted that instead of protecting me from uncertainty, he had forced me to carry his doubt and attached my dignity to public compliance. Then, in front of everyone, he looked at me and said, "Jenna, I was wrong. Completely, publicly, unforgivably wrong." I stood up and walked to the center of the room, took the microphone from his hand, and looked at all the people who loved me. I told them that when this started, I thought the worst possible outcome would be learning he wasn't my biological father, but that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was realizing that a man can raise you and still make you feel like your whole life has been one long audition for his acceptance. I told them biology had not broken this family, ego had, silence had, humiliation had. I said I did not lose a father because of a DNA result. I lost one because when he had the chance to love me without conditions, he chose suspicion instead. Then I turned back to him and said the only thing that mattered. You wanted me to prove I was yours, but the real question was whether you had ever behaved like I was safe with you. He tried to say my name, but I stopped him. I told him that tomorrow I would still get married, but he would not be the one walking beside me. Then something happened that would have sounded too dramatic if I hadn't watched it with my own eyes. My father dropped to his knees in front of the entire room and begged me not to erase him. The irony of that almost took my breath away, because he had spent years trying to erase pieces of me first. I looked down at him and said, "You tried to erase me before I ever stopped calling you my father." Then I stepped back, returned the microphone, and walked to my seat. No one clapped. No one rushed to rescue him. Real consequences don't sound theatrical when they land. They feel heavy, still, undeniable. My fiancé took my hand and kissed my forehead. My mother cried openly, but for once she did not ask me to make her feel better. The next day, I got married under a clear California sky. I did not walk down the aisle with my father. I did not walk with my mother either. I walked alone, because after everything that had been taken from me, I needed every step to belong only to me. When I reached the front, my fiancé took my hands and whispered, "You're here. That's all that matters." My father sat in the second row, not hidden, not honored, just present enough to witness the future he had almost destroyed and the place he no longer had the power to define. He cried through most of the ceremony. I didn't look away, but I didn't look for him either, because that is what revenge became for me in the end. Not cruelty, not screaming, not chaos for spectacle. It was surviving beautifully in the exact place where someone tried to reduce me and letting the truth define him more completely than I ever had to. After the wedding, I opened the hospital folder again and realized there was still another story waiting in it. Another child, another family, another life tangled with mine because of one buried mistake and years of cowardice. Maybe one day I'll tell that story too. But this one ended the moment I stopped asking my father to define me and started letting the truth define him instead. So tell me honestly, if you were in my place, would you have kept his secret to protect the family name? Or would you have done exactly what I did and made him face the truth in front of everyone? The Revenge Argon team is committed to creating meaningful, well-crafted fictional stories that not only entertain, but also share valuable lessons with our audience. Every story on this channel is created for educational and inspirational purposes, with the goal of delivering thoughtful messages through powerful storytelling. Jenna handled the situation with courage, dignity, and a strong sense of self-worth, refusing to let humiliation define her future. Instead of staying silent, she chose truth and stood up for herself in a way that changed everything. If you were in her position, how would you have handled it? Would you have exposed the truth or chosen a different path?